Hi, and welcome back. This is the third video number 3 in my series on introductory music theory for guitar players or other fretted stringed instruments players. So the first thing I want to say before I get into today's lesson is that if you haven't watched my videos number 1 and number 2, I really encourage you to do that. Because otherwise, looking at this lesson alone, unless you've really got some foundational experience in music theory, may not make a lot of sense. So with that, let's get on to this particular lesson. Now, in one of the earlier videos, I talked about how we determine the appropriate chords or the accompanying chords in musical keys. And we know that there are major keys and associated minor keys, and so to play a particular song in a specific key, we already can figure out how to determine 6 main chords that could comprise the chords in that song. 3 chords from the major key and 3 chords from the accompanying minor key. So today I want to talk about what I encouraged you in the previous video to do, to sort of experiment and explore, to try to determine the 6 chords that we would use to play a song in the key of A. Now this is important not only for figuring out how to play a song that you may already know and like and want to learn, but for those of you that are music composers and are creating your own music, these rules of music theory are at least a place to start. Now, when you're the mighty creator and you're making your own music, you don't have to follow anyone else's rules. You can create music however you want and whatever best suits you and what you're trying to do with your instrument. But this gives you a foundation of, as I say, the place to start. So let's go ahead and get on with it. So today I want to talk about the key of A. And I had already mentioned that keys can be major and keys can be minor. So we have major keys and minor keys, but keys can be in other ways, and that's a subject for another discussion or another video. So given that, the first part of our discussion today needs to be about scales, musical scales. Now, I've talked about musical scales already, and I've talked about the fact that basic musical scales are composed of 8 notes or 8 tones that form an octave for that scale. But those notes and correspondingly those octaves will be different for each particular key. And their origins come from the piano. So even though I'm not a piano player, you may not be a piano player, remember that in fact the piano is a stringed instrument. So it's not that far a distant cousin from guitars, banjos, mandolins, even bass viols and cellos and violins. They all have their origins in terms of musical theory in the piano. So we're first going to talk about something that I call the major scale. And I've got some examples here that come from the piano keyboard. So hopefully you're a little bit familiar with the piano keyboard. So a major scale, as I said, is going to be composed of those 8 tones. And the differences between those tones I'm going to call steps. And so steps in a musical scale or steps on a piano keyboard can be either a whole step or a half step. And so as my pictures show, if you move from one white key to the next white key and there's a black key in between, that's going to designate a whole step. If you move from a white key to the next adjacent black key, that's going to denote a half step. And again, if you take a look at a piano keyboard, you'll see that there are some white keys with no black key in between. And so if you move from one of those white keys to the next adjacent white key where there is no black key, that is also going to be denoting a half step. So our musical scale is going to be comprised of combinations of whole steps and half steps. So our musical scale, remember, we denote by the letters from A through G. And our white keys are going to be our whole tones, and the black keys are going to be indicating notes that are either we call sharp or flat. So again, just as another quick example, my cartoon here shows 3 piano keys, 2 white keys and 1 black key. And just as an example, if this key on the left is the note A, the next adjacent going up the piano keyboard, or to the right as you'd sit at the piano keyboard, the next white key would be the note B, and the black key in between we can denote one of 2 ways. If we're sort of moving up the scale from A to B, we would call that note A sharp. If we're moving in the opposite direction from B to the lower note, A, then we could also designate that same black key as a B flat. So the white keys all only have one name for that note, but the black keys can be designated as either a sharped or a raised note from the next lower key, or a flat or a lowered note, depending upon the adjacent higher white key. So in fact, we can expand our simple musical scale of A through G to include those flatted and sharped notes. And so you can see I've written it out here from A through G, but I've included the places where we've got some sharped notes that can also be designated as flatted notes. Now, the one important thing to recognize here from this description is that there are recurring places on the piano keyboard where there's no black key between adjacent white keys, and that's between the notes B and C and the notes E and F. So while we move from the note A to the next adjacent white key with an intervening black key, to move from this A to this B, we'd call that a whole step. But if we go up further here and we move from the white key E to the next white key F, where there is no black key, that's going to be designated, as I explained previously, as just a half step. So let's think about this a bit. To create a scale, we may be including notes that are flatted or sharped, and we have a combination of whole steps and half steps. So that's why some musical keys, like the key of C, are very simple. Others are more complicated because of the addition of these flatted or sharped musical notes. Now, just to digress for a minute, for stringed instrument players, we don't play the piano. So while I use the piano description to talk about this difference between a whole note, which would be a difference between keys where there's an intervening black key, versus half steps to move from a white note to the adjacent black key on a fretted fretboard, this cartoon illustrates the difference. So this is my fretboard going horizontally, and you can see my strings there. And so if I change from one note by 1 fret to the next note, either up or down, that's going to be a half step in terms of those 2 notes. They're a half step apart. If I move, however, the distance of 2 frets whether I move up 2 frets or down 2 frets, that's going to be designated as a whole step. So we can create half steps and whole steps on our fretted stringed instrument keyboard. If any of this is confusing, please feel free to stop and go back. I'm trying to move through these quickly so you don't spend a lot of time watching my videos. There's tons of this stuff out on YouTube and other places on the internet, but I'm doing this for a particular reason because I'm trying to keep my explanations as simple as I can, because I figure if I can understand them, then hopefully other people will be able to understand them as well. So, given our understanding now of musical keys, the notes in those keys and their scales, and how we determine the chords in those keys, I want to describe for you in a little bit more detail how you can determine any major scale. And it's by following, again, another simple rule. So for any major scale, this is the rule to determine the notes in that scale. We always start on whatever scale it's going to be on our one note, and then we're going to follow our 7 notes to the octave note, but the amount of step that we take is going to follow this rule for all major scales. We're going to have a whole step, then a half step, then 3 whole steps, and concluding with a half step. So it's whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. That will create a major scale for any particular key depending upon any note that you want to start with. So, now that we have all of this knowledge under our belts, let's go back to my original suggestion and talk about the key of A. So following that rule, these would be the notes in the key of A. We start with our A note, and our first step has to be a whole step. So on a piano keyboard, we'd go past the A sharp, B flat, black key, and we'd go to the B key. Then we have to have another whole step. So we'd go from the B key on the piano keyboard to the C sharp key on the piano keyboard. Now, this might not make sense when you think about it because I've been talking about A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But the fact is if you remember, I mentioned that the distance between B and C and E and F on the piano keyboard or on your guitar fretboard or your mandolin fretboard or your cello fretboard for that matter, even though it doesn't have frets, is only a half step. So in order to create a whole step between B and the next note in the A major scale, we have to move 2 keys, or on our fretted fretboard, 2 frets. So that's how we get this distance going from A to B to C sharp. So continuing to follow our rule, we've got a whole step. Now we need a half step. So we'd move either 1 key from black to white or white to black, or 1 fret on our fretted fretboard. So we go from C sharp to D. Now it becomes a little easier. We've got a whole step between D and E, another whole step between E, but if we go to F natural, remember there's no black key there, and we'd only be going 1 fret, so we have to go an extra fret or an extra key, so that takes us to make a whole step from E to F sharp. Then we have to take another whole step, can't just be to G, F sharp to G would only be a half step. So we have to go from F sharp, 2 keys, or 2 frets to G sharp. And then we take the last half step from G sharp. A half step would be the A. And so that finishes our octave. So we can see that in the A major scale, we've got 3 notes that are sharped. F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp. Now, if you look at musical notation, there's a very easy way to determine a particular song and the key that it's in. I'll just show you a piece of a song here. I'll try not to show the name because I don't want to infringe any copyrights. But in standard musical notation, at the very left, you're going to see the musical staff, and here I've got the treble clef. That's this first character. And then in this particular piece of music, there's a series of 3 sharps. And without delving into how to read musical notation, because that's not our purpose here, you don't need to know how. But you would be able to recognize, if you look at the musical staff here, at the beginning of each staff, there are those same 3 sharps. That's the musical key signature, and it tells people who read that musical notation what key that particular piece is in. By that, I mean what notes to have sharped or flatted. So for us stringed instrument players, we've got a couple examples. The simplest key signature is no sharps or flats, and that's the key of C. And we know that from our octave, and if you follow that rule, whole step, half step, 3 whole steps, and a half step, and you do that like I just did for the key of A, you'll see that the musical scale for the notes for the key of C are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. Follows the rule, no sharps or flats. The example in video 2 where I looked at the key of G, I did mention that there's 1 sharp, it's the F sharp, that would designate the key of G. So if you learn to read musical notation, all you'd have to do is look at this key signature and you'd understand, okay, this piece of music is in the key of G. And since I followed my other rules, I know that I've got 6 chords that I can play: G, C, D7. The accompanying minor key is going to be E minor, and then I've got 3 more chords: E minor, A minor, and B7. So for our key of A, we know there's going to be 3 sharps. So if you see a piece written with 3 sharps, F sharp, C sharp, and G sharp, we know that tune is going to be played in the key of A. So let's follow our rule for the key of A. And so we find out that chords in the key of A, and again, I don't always use the term major, but technically you'd want to always designate a key as being a major key or a minor key. If we don't say, typically the understanding is that we're always talking about the major key. So we've got A major. Our 1 note is going to be A, so our first chord will be an A major chord. Our 4 chord will be the D chord, and our 5 chord will be the E7, following the 1-4-5 rule. Our accompanying minor, now that we know that there are sharps and flats in the A major scale, is going to be F sharp minor, because the 6th note in the A major scale is F sharp. And following our 1-4-5 rule, we know that the additional 3 chords we can use relative to the key of A major are going to be F sharp minor. The 4th note in that scale beginning on F is going to be a B, so that chord would be B minor. And our 5th chord, our 5th note corresponding to that note in the scale is going to be C sharp, and so that last chord would be a C sharp 7th chord. So I've stretched an awful lot of information into only about 20 minutes. I appreciate your hanging in there with me, but that really explains for the key of A how to determine the particular notes in the A major scale, and then once you know the scale, whether it's going to include any sharp or flatted notes, you can determine, following the 1-4-5 rules and knowing that the relative minor key starts on the 6th note of the accompanying major scale, you can determine those 6 starting chords. Whether you're going to attempt to put chords to a song that you already know, or whether you're writing something completely creative of your own making, at least that gives you a starting place for a scale of notes and 6 chords to start with, and from there, the sky's the limit. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope that if you don't understand something, you take the time to stop, go back, and listen to me explain it again. And apart from that, I hope everybody grabs a guitar and has a wonderful day. See ya.